IELTS Reading Out Loud, Day 3. Tea, Tea and the Industrial Revolution. A Cambridge professor says that a change in drinking habits was the reason for the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Anja Bajwa reports. Alan McFarlane, professor of anthropological science at King's College, Cambridge, has, like other historians, spent decades wrestling with the enigma of the Industrial Revolution. Why did this particular Big Bang, the world-changing burst of industry, happen in Britain? And why did it strike at the end of the 18th century? McFarlane compares the puzzle to a combination lock. There are about 20 different factors, and all of them need to be present before the revolution can happen, he says. For industry to take off, there needs to be the technology and power to drive factories, large urban populations to provide cheap labor, easy transport to move goods around, an affluent middle class willing to buy mass-produced objects, a market-driven economy, and a political system that allows this to happen. While this was the case for England, other nations, such as Japan, the Netherlands, and France, also meet some of these criteria, but were not industrializing. All these factors must have been necessary, but not sufficient to cause the revolution, says McFarlane. After all, Holland had everything except coal, while China also had many of these factors. Most historians are convinced there are one or two missing factors that you need to open the lock. The missing factors, he proposed, are to be found in almost even kitchen cupboard. In every kitchen cupboard, it should be like that. Tea and beer, two of the nation's favorite drinks, fueled the revolution. The antiseptic properties of tannin, the active ingredient in tea, and the hops of beer, plus the fact that both are made with boiled water, allowed urban communities to flourish at close quarters without succumbing to waterborne diseases such as dysentery. The theory sounds eccentric, but once he starts to explain the detective work that went into his deduction, the skepticism gives way to wary admiration. McFarlane's case has been strengthened by support from notable quarters. Roy Porter, the distinguished medical historian, recently wrote a favorable appraisal of his research. McFarlane had wondered for a long time how the Industrial Revolution came about. Historians had aligned on one interesting factor around the mid-18th century that required explanation. Between about 1650 and 1740, the population in Britain was static, but then there was a burst in population growth. McFarlane says the infant mortality rate halved in the space of 20 years, and this happened in both rural areas and cities, and across all classes. People suggested four possible causes. Was there a sudden change in the viruses and bacteria around? Unlikely. There was a revolution in medical science. No, was there a revolution in medical science? But this was a century before Lister's revolution. Was there a change in environmental conditions? There were improvements in agriculture that wiped out malaria, but these were small gains. Sanitation did not become widespread until the 19th century. The only option left is food. But the height and weight statistics shows a decline. so the food must have got worse. Efforts to explain the sudden reduction in child deaths appeared to draw a blank. This population burst seemed to happen at just the right time to provide labor for the Industrial Revolution. When you start moving towards an industrial revolution, it is economically efficient to have people living close together, says Macfarlane. But then you get disease, particularly from human waste. Some digging around in historical records revealed that there was a change in the incidence of waterborne disease at that time, especially dysentery. Macfarlane deduced that whatever the British were drinking must have been important in regulating disease, he says. He says, we drank beer for a long time. The English were protected by the strong antibacterial agents in hops, which were added to help preserve the beer. But in the late 17th century, a tax was introduced on malt, the basic ingredient of beer. The poor turned to water and gin, in the 1720s, the mortality rate began to rise again. Then it suddenly dropped again. What caused this? Macfarlane looked into Japan, which was also developing large cities about the same time and also had no sanitation. Waterborne diseases had a much looser grip on the Japanese population than those in Britain. Could it be the prevalence of tea in the culture? Macfarlane then noted that the history of tea in Britain provided an extraordinary coincidence of dates. Tea was relatively expensive until Britain started a direct clipper trade with China in the early 18th century. By the 1740s, about the time that infant mortality was dipping, the drink was common. Macfarlane guessed that the fact that water had to be boiled together with the stomach purifying properties of tea meant that the breast milk provided by mother was healthier than it had ever been. No other European nation sipped tea like the British, which, by Macfarlane's logic, pushed these other countries out of connection for the revolution. But if tea is a factor in the combination lock, why didn't Japan forge ahead in a tea-soaked industrial revolution of its own? Macfarlane notes that even though 17th century, Japan had large cities which high literacy rate. Macfarlane notes that even though 17th century Japan had large cities, high literacy rates, even a futurist market, it had turned its back on the essence of any work-based revolution by giving up labor-saving devices such as animal, afraid that they would put people out of work. So the nation that we now think of as one of the most technologically advanced entered the 19th century having abandoned the wheel. Right. Part 2, Gifted Children and Learning. Internationally, giftedness is almost frequently determined by a score of a general intelligence test known as an IQ test, which is above a chosen cutoff point, usually at around the top 2 to 5%. Children's educational environment contributes to the IQ score and the way intelligence is used. For example, a very close positive relationship was found when children's IQ scores were compared with their home educational provision, Freeman, 2010. The higher the children's IQ scores, especially over 130, the better the quality of their educational backup, measured in terms of reported verbal interactions with parents, number of books and activities in the home, etc. Because IQ tests are decidedly influenced by what the child has learned, they are to some extent measures of because IQ tests are decidedly influenced by what the child has learned, they are to some extent measures of current achievement based on age norms. That is how well the children have learned to manipulate their knowledge and know how within the terms of the test. The, the vocabulary aspect, for example, is dependent on having heard those words, but IQ tests can neither identify the process of learning and thinking nor predict creativity. Excellence does not emerge without appropriate help. To reach an exceptionally high standard in any area, very able children need the means to learn, which includes material to work with and focused challenging tuition, and the encouragement to follow their dream. This appears to be a qualitative difference in the way the intellectually highly able to think, compared with more average ability or older pupils, for whom external regulation by the teacher often compensates for the lack of internal regulation. To be at their most effective in their self-regulation, all children can be helped to identify their own ways of learning, metacognition, which will include strategies of planning, monitoring, evaluation, and choice of what to learn. Emotional awareness is also part of metacognition, so children should be helped to be aware of their feelings around the area to be learned, feelings of curiosity or confidence, for example. High achievers have been around to use self-regulatory learning strategies more often and more effectively than lower achievers, and are better able to transfer these strategies to deal with unfamiliar tasks. This happens to such a high degree in some children that they appear to be demonstrating talent in particular areas. Overviewing research on the thinking process of highly able children, Shore and Kanbisky, 1993, put the instructor's problems succinctly. If they, the gifted, merely think more quickly, then we need only teach more quickly. If they merely make fewer errors, then they can shorten the practice. Then we can shorten the practice. But of course, this is not entirely the case. Adjustments have to be made in methods of learning and teaching to take account of the many ways individuals think. Yet, in order to learn by themselves, the gifted do need some support from their teachers. Conversely, teachers who have a tendency to over-direct can diminish their gifted pupils' learning autonomy. Although spoon feeding can produce extremely high examination results, these are not always followed by equally impressive life successes. Too much dependence on the teacher risks loss of autonomy and motivation to discover. However, the teacher or pupil to reflect on their own learning and thinking activities. They increase their pupils' self-regulation. For a young child, it may be just a simple question, "What have you learned today?" which helps them to recognize what they are doing, given that a fundamental goal of education is to transfer the control of learning from teachers to pupils. Improving pupils' learning to learn techniques should be a major outcome of the school experience, especially for the highly competent. There are quite a number of new methods which can help, such as child-initiated learning, ability peer tutoring, etc. Such practices have been found to be particularly useful for blind children from deprived areas. But scientific progress is not all theoretical. Knowledge is a so vital knowledge is so vital to outstanding performance. Individuals who know a great deal about a specific domain will achieve at a higher level than those who do not. Elshout, 1995. Research with, with creative scientists by Simonton, 1988, brought him to the conclusion that above a certain high level, characteristics such as independence seem to contribute more to reaching the highest levels of expertise than intellectual skills, due to the great demands of efforts and time needed for learning and practice. Creativity in all forms can be seen as expertise mixed with a high level of motivation. Weisberg, 1993. To sum up, learning is affected by emotions of both the individual and significant others. Positive emotions facilitate the creative aspects of learning, and negative emotions inhibit it. Fear, for example, can limit the development of curiosity, which is a strong force in scientific advance because it motivates problem-solving behavior. In Burkhart's 1991 review of emotion, the learning of very high IQ and highly achieving children, she found emotional forces in harness. They were not only curious, but often had a strong desire to control their environment, improve their learning efficiency, and increase their own learning resources. Part 3. Museums of Fine Art and their public. The fact that people go to the Louvre Museum in Paris to see the original painting Mona Lisa when they can see a reproduction anywhere leads us to question some assumptions about the role of museums of fine arts in today's world. One of the most famous works of art in the world is Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Nearly everyone who goes to see the original will already be familiar with it from reproductions, but they accept that fine art is more rewardingly viewed in its original form. However, if Mona Lisa was a famous novel, few people would bother to go to a museum to read the writer's actual manuscript rather than a printed reproduction. This might be explained by the fact that the novel has evolved precisely because of technological developments that made it possible to print out huge numbers of text, whereas oil paintings have always been reproduced as unique objects. In addition, it could be argued that the practice of interpreting or reading each medium follows different conventions. With novels, the reader attends mainly to the meaning of words rather than the way they are printed on the page, whereas the reader of the painting must attend just as closely to the material form of marks and shapes in the picture as to any ideas they may signify. Yet it has always been possible to make very accurate facsimiles of pretty well any fine art work. The 7 surviving versions of Mona Lisa bear witness to the fact that in the 16th century, artists seemed perfectly content to assign the reproduction of their creations to their workshop apprentices as regular bread and butter work. And today the task of reproducing pictures is comparably more simple and reliable, with reprographic techniques that allow the production of high-quality prints made exactly to the original scale, with faithful color values and even with duplication of the surface relief of the painting. But despite an implicit recognition that the spread of good reproductions can be culturally valuable, museums continue to promote the special status of original work. Unfortunately, this seems to place severe limitations on the kind of experience offered to visitors. One limitation is related to the way museum presents its exhibits as repositories of unique historical objects. Art museums are often called treasure houses. One limitation is related to the way the museum presents its exhibits as repositories of unique historical objects. Art museums are often called treasure houses. Oh yeah, right. We are reminded of this even before we view a collection of the presence of security guards, attendants, ropes, and display cases to keep us away from the exhibits. In many cases, the architectural style of the building further reinforced that notion. In addition, a major collection like that of London's National Gallery is housed in numerous rooms, each with dozens of works, any one of which is likely to be worth more than all the average visitor possesses. In a society that judges the personal status of the individual so much by their material worth, it is therefore difficult not to be impressed by one's own relative worthlessness in such an environment. Furthermore, consideration of the value of the original work in its treasure house setting impresses Furthermore, consideration of the value of the original work in its treasure house setting impresses upon the viewer that, since these works were originally produced, they have been assigned a huge monetary value by some person or institution more powerful than themselves. Evidently, nothing the viewer thinks about the work is going to alter that value, and so today's viewer is deterred from trying to extend that spontaneous, immediate, self-reliant kind of reading which would originally have met the work. The visitor may then be struck by the strangeness of seeing such diverse paintings, drawings, and sculptures brought together in an environment for which they were not originally created. This displacement effect is further heightened by the sheer volumes of exhibits. In the case of a major collection, there are probably more works on display than we could realistically view in weeks or even months. This is particularly distressing because time seems to be a vital factor in the appreciation of all art forms. A fundamental difference between paintings and other art forms is that there is no prescripted time over which a painting is viewed. By contrast, the audience encourage an opera or a play over a specific time, which is the duration of the performance. Similarly, novels and poems are read in a prescripted temporal sequence, whereas a picture has no clear place at which to start viewing or at which to finish. Thus, artworks themselves encourage us to view them superficially without appreciating the richness of details and labor that is involved. Consequently, the dominant critical approach becomes that of the art historian, a specialized academic approach devoted to discovering the meaning of art within the cultural context of its time. This is in perfect harmony with the museum's function, since the approach is dedicated to seeking out and conserving authentic, original readings of the exhibit. Again, this seems to put paid to that spontaneous participators' criticism, participators' criticism, which can be found in abundance in criticism of classic works of literature, but is absent from most art history. The displays of art museums serve as a warning of what critical practices can emerge when spontaneous criticism is suppressed. The museum public, like any other audience, experience art more rewardingly when given the confidence to express their views. If appropriate works of fine art could be rendered permanently accessible to the public means by means of high fidelity reproductions, as literature and music already are, the public may feel somewhat less in awe of them. Unfortunately, that may be too much to ask from those who seek to maintain and control the art establishment.